put your paws to attention, and I mean that. Our first guest on today's Big Blend Radio Way Back When History Show is author Trevor Jones. He's an author of a number of award-winning books, all kinds of articles about museums, American history. He's worked as a museum curator, an exhibition designer, an educator, and he's also the director and CEO of the Nebraska State Historical Society. So we want to visit him when we get to Nebraska. I'm just saying this over and over because we're going to get to Nebraska on our Love Your Parks tour. I know it'll happen. We do all kinds of detours and we get places sooner than we ever thought this year. For sure, it's happened. But he's joining us today to talk about his latest book, Major, a Soldier Dog, and it features illustrations by Ming Hai, and you can go to 6 Foot Publishing to learn more, or 6footpress.com, I should say. Get right to the website to get the book, and go to Amazon, all those stores. And I want to say, go to your independent bookstore and ask for the book. That's also a way you can get it in person or even delivered to you online. So, Trevor, welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Hey, it is good to have you on here, and it's good to talk about Nebraska history. And Nancy and I, neither one of us had any clue that you had a fort, and the fort taught dogs how to be war dogs. We didn't even know there were war dogs. So this is like a whole new thing. We know horses were involved in wars, but dogs, was it World War II that it started, or before that for dogs?
In the United States, it really starts in World War II, and it's very much a national story, because what happened was when we first entered World War II, we were suddenly fighting a war on 2 fronts, and the idea was we needed soldiers to, any place that we could get them. And so they started thinking, well, what would help? And the thought was, well, dogs could help. They could carry bandages. They could sniff out landmines. They could go on patrols and avoid ambushes, and they could help us. So we should have some dogs. Other countries had dog training programs, but not the United States for the military. Wow. And we had one really big problem with that idea, is that the United States had no military dogs. It had no military dog training program, and it didn't have any dogs at all to train. So they had a solution, a national solution, and that was to ask the American people to give up their pets to the war dog training program. And so these were just, regular people with their animals at home, and you would donate your dog, and they would put it in a crate, and they'd put it on a train, and they'd send it off to places like western Nebraska, Fort Robinson, and then they would train that dog to be a military dog. And that's how it happened. And people did this by the tens of thousands.
Wow. That's amazing, because this is your family pet. And wasn't like the pit bull the American dog, like the family dog way back then at that point? Like the pit bull was one, and I know now everyone's kind of scared of pit bulls, but that shouldn't be. It's just how we raise them. But the American pit bull was like, there were like war dogs that we kind of heard about, but didn't really quite get the story. What I love about your book is that it is geared towards the youth, and hopefully parents will get involved and understand these stories too. But you bring in the dog's sense of smell. And I think that, and it's, especially when it comes to food, you always include that part. And I think that's where the human connection is with that, especially kids. They understand food smells. But you bring that in, so that's part of, I would say, one of their biggest attributes for a military is that the dogs can smell. They smell bombs. Dogs are known to smell cancer. I mean, that's really one of their biggest, qualities.
Absolutely, and that's one of the things that they really could do in World War II is dogs showed their value, especially in places like the South Pacific where they were fighting in jungles, and it was very hard to see, and people could be camouflaged. Your enemy soldiers were well camouflaged, so they would take dogs out, and dogs could smell and they could hear better than we can, and so they would take them out and they would detect the ambush before it happened, and so they could either go around or back up or call in an artillery strike, whatever they needed to do, and dogs were credited with saving hundreds, if not thousands, of American soldiers' lives in World War II, just because their senses are so much better than ours in both smell and hearing.
Was Fort Robinson, the War Dogs Training Center, was Fort Robinson the main place, or are there other places through the country that train dogs?
Beginning of the war, there were training centers in Virginia and Montana and California and Nebraska, but the one at Fort Robinson was the largest one, and by the end of the war, Fort Robinson was the only one remaining. And so one of the things I love about this story is that people gave up their pets, and the reason I wanted to write this book and especially do it as a children's book with these lovely illustrations that Ming Hai did for us is to get at those concepts of sacrifice and patriotism, which are, I think, hard concepts for adults to sometimes get at, but really difficult for kids because it's pretty abstract. But when you start phrasing this as, would you give up your pet to help your country, or would you give up your pet to help somebody else, to help something larger than yourself, then you can really get at those concepts, because that's what Americans did. I mean, they loved their pets. We love our pets. They're like family, and people 75 years ago felt the same way. This wasn't easy, but they were giving up something, and they didn't know their dog would come back. I mean, there was no guarantee there. This was a risk, and dogs were killed in the war. They died of disease, they died of accidents, and they died in combat.
This is, I mean, I know we pet sit, right? And we're just sitting with these beautiful dogs.
I'm just going,
they're like our friends and lovey-dovey, and I really can't call them guard dogs at all. But, and I even just think about them, I'm be like, no.
No,
I'm holding on to
no.
Heck no. But
we're not threatened right now.
No, we're not threatened. But I think it's a very interesting thing that you bring up, because right now the country is not at a normal calm, right? Our country isn't. We can't, tiptoe around that. That's a real thing. And I don't think the whole world is kind of at this heat level. And I don't want to say World War III or anything. I don't want that.
No.
But I feel like we have to go back to those qualities of understanding what war is. I feel like we've kind of lost sight of just how bad it can be, how destructive it is, and also understanding sacrifice, like you talked about. I just feel like we've got it to this just kind of yelling portion, and at this point we need to understand some values. And I think that's what your book does, is bring us back home. You know what I mean? To what those, just, hello, your dog going off to war, that's a huge thing for, the pet parents and the kids to understand. It's a big deal for the dogs. And I think right now we can kind of learn those lessons so that we don't jump to the fire too fast, if that, you know what I mean? I'm not trying to be political. I'm just saying these values are important.
Right. And the book has a very personal story, because it's called Major, a Soldier Dog, and Major was an actual dog who served in World War II, and he was given up for the Dogs for Defense program and by an actual kid whose name was Sid. And the book tells the story of Sid putting Major on a train and giving him up as a little boy. And this is all true. There was a real Major and there was a real Sid. And when I started working on this book, the actual Sid had written a letter to my organization, History Nebraska, and he had told a little bit about that story of giving his dog up when he was 5 years old, and how absolutely wrenching that was for him, and how he remembered that like it was yesterday. So when I started researching the book, I wonder if Sid is still living. And so I tracked him down, and he is still alive, and I got to interview him for this, and he remembers this moment when he was 5 and he put Major in the crate and sent him off to Fort Robinson, Nebraska, like it was yesterday. And and so that's part of that story, is that individual sacrifice. And then when Sid grew up, he actually enlisted in the military. He was an officer, and he traces his enlistment and his service to his country from that moment, because he felt like if his dog could serve and sacrifice for the country, he should do the same. And so this was a really core moment in his upbringing, in his life, and how he thought about the world.
Wow. And for you, connecting with him, I mean, that had to push you to do the best you can, right? You already have that in you, but you know what I mean? When you connect with someone who's been in a world war, I mean, there's not very many of them left, our veterans from the world wars, or So I think that's got to be a big deal to have met Sid.
Well, absolutely, and one of the great things about this project is that we had a lot of interviews and reminiscences from soldiers who had served with dogs in our collection here at History Nebraska, and I was able to use those, and a lot of those people have passed on. So it was great to be able to sort of honor those memories. And it's a book for kids, but the illustrations are historically accurate. They're based on what Fort Robinson looked like, what the dog program looked like, and we did a lot of research about dogs and how they behave, because the story is told from the perspective of Major. It's told from a dog's point of view, and so Major is all about smells, and he's all about how things smell, and we tried to illustrate that visually with the illustrations that Ming Hai did, and sort of get at that. So there's a scene in the book where Major gets sent overseas. He's getting sent to Europe, and they sent both humans and dogs on boats, and one of the things is that dogs get seasick just like people get seasick, and so we represented that as him being sick as he goes across as being a miserable dog. And we had diary entries in our collection from soldiers that were serving with the war dog program, and they talked about how miserable they were and how miserable the dogs were for that entire crossing. It was weeks of misery on board ship.
I bet. Yeah, I bet.
Oh.
I mean, seriously, when you think about it, they've got 4 feet. We have 2, and we're miserable, so they're probably doubly miserable. It sounds like they should be more stable, but that's not their deal,
And we don't speak their language. That's the other thing that's really hard. It's really hard to help animals if you can't hear what they're saying. You don't have that same language, though we do, but we can tap in as best we can. But I think that's one of the hardest things for veterinarians is, what are you saying? What hurts where? To be able to help
and
them.
I think that's one of the things that they learned in very much in World War II. So if you think about all the things that we use dogs for today in terms of being service animals or even military dogs today, and back in World War II, there were no training manuals when they started this. There was no uniform way of, how do you train a dog? And so they had to develop that, and they developed a war dog training manual during World War II. And then a lot of the people that trained these dogs, when they returned to civilian life, they kept training dogs, and they trained dogs for the visually impaired, and they used those same techniques. And so there's a continuity between 75 years ago and today in terms of how we think about dogs and use them as service animals. And one of the key parts that comes out of this training program in World War II was they really decided that you had to have a partnership with the animal. If it was a service animal, that you had to have a relationship between the handler, the person who was working, and the dog, and that had to be based on mutual trust, and it could not be based on fear. So you couldn't train a dog by making it afraid of you and expect it to work well with you. It had to be a relationship, and that's the only way that they really worked well in a combat situation, because the dog had to be able to trust the soldier, and the soldier had to be able to trust the dog, and there's a mutual relationship. And that is really still one of the absolute core tenets of training service animals of any type today, is that bond and that trust. And that's something that came out of directly. I mean, it's explicitly stated in the training manual that the dog shall not be ruled by fear, and that's what they said. So there's some of that way that you think about animals today. I mean, they've certainly improved training methods, but that has its origin in World War II.
Wow, that's amazing, because we just recorded this interview with Dr. Gary Weitzman. He's a veterinarian and CEO of San Diego Humane Society, and he wrote 2 books for National Geographic. He's written a number of books, but it was a kid's book about teaching your dogs, training your dogs and your cats. And his whole thing is like no fear training. It's all about no fear. And so it's really interesting talking to you. It's like this whole full circle coming around, because I don't think fear, because there's no core in that. Nothing. You'll get bitten if it's fear. But it's interesting too. We lived in Arizona for a number of years, and California, Southern California, and we lived in Mexico. And you go through the border and border patrol crossings, and there's always dogs, and you want to pet the dogs, but the dogs are I mean, they're sniffing everything out, and I've watched dogs take down cocaine things, and somebody in front of me in a car, like this dog knew it. You wouldn't see it, and the dog knew this is what happened. And, it's just like this, I don't know, it's an amazing relationship, between the Border Patrol agent and the dog, and just like, whoa, don't mess with them, man. Heck no. But the dog really knows what airports, right, Nancy? Yeah. Dogs know. Dogs know.
Well, yeah, and I have to say that that's one of the absolute best parts of this World War II story is that the military used these dogs all over the world, and then at the end of the war, when the war ended, pretty much almost exactly 75 years ago, right now, they brought those dogs back to Fort Robinson, Nebraska, and they shipped them all the way back, and then they spent weeks training them no longer to be war dogs, but to be pets again. So when they were soldiers, only their handler could touch them, and there were certain rules. And then when they brought them back, they had to train them to be pets, and that's what they did. So they spent weeks training them, and then they shipped those dogs back at government expense back to the people that had originally donated them to the program.
Wow.
So if you had given up your dog a couple of years before to fight in the war, when the war ended, if you were lucky, and not all dogs survived, but many did, then you got your dog back, showed back up at the train station, and you not only got your dog, but you got a doggy discharge paper that said your dog had been honorably discharged from the U.S. military, just like soldiers did, and you had your pet back, and they really cared a lot about making sure that they got those dogs back to people. And I'm not giving the story away from the book Major, a Soldier Dog if I say that Major came back. It ends happily. He comes back to Sid, and that's what happened in real life. And there's a picture in the back of the book of real Sid and real Major together, the actual ones, years ago. And then there's a picture of Major's doggy discharge from World War II, showing that he had been a soldier dog. So, they really did think about them as a loan from the American people and not, just a military asset.
But we learned from it. That was, the whole thing. At the end of the day, we learned, right? And that's how we have dogs at Border Patrol, airports. I mean, even in September 11th, didn't they help find the bodies under the rubble?
Yep.
Yeah. Wow. So
I think animals are really way smarter than we give them credit for. Mm-hmm. We're always kind of like we're the ultimate species looking down on the others, and we're going to control, train, do all that. And I think they have abilities that we don't see because we always put ourselves at the top of the chain. And I think sometimes just opening your mind a little bit without going, we're at the top, and just looking at any animal species, you'll find they have abilities that we haven't recognized before because we don't want to see it.
It's amazing that they did this in World War II and going, hey, okay, let's use our dogs. I wonder about that when that first happened and someone comes up with that idea, what that was like if people thought it was nutty. You know what I mean? Do you mean my dog that plays fetch, for that to happen?
Yeah, I think some people did, but I think they saw that potential, and certainly not every dog succeeded in getting through the program, and they had a rigorous training program. And so if your dog wasn't, war dog material, they would send it back to you and say, I'm sorry, it didn't pass the tests, because they had to be very serious about that. Like one of the things that they did is that dogs had to pass basically basic training, and they had to learn not only voice commands, but they had to learn silent commands, arm commands. So if they were telling them, because if you've got your dog on the battlefield and you're trying to avoid an ambush, you don't want to have to say something out loud, and you need the dog to be quiet, and it needs to recognize what you want it to do. So they had arm commands for jump and lay down and come here and go away and all the rest of that, and the dogs had to pass those tests. So not every dog was suited for it.
Yeah, they said that for the September 11 dogs. We did a couple interviews years ago about that. And it was there like, if your dog is one of the dogs that will just keep going after a ball and fetch and really I'll go in the bushes to find that toy or whatever, that was a candidate. So that's interesting you say that. Do you think that it was more dogs that were hunting dogs and farm dogs that are used to work, like sheepdog, like, Australian sheepdogs that are herding dogs and things like that were taken in.
Well, at the beginning of the war, they were desperate, so they took in pretty much any dog anybody wanted to give them. They wanted a certain height, a certain weight, but they took in Great Danes, and they took in poodles, and they took in Dalmatians. Wow. They took in all these animals, and they tried everything. They wanted dogs, and they wanted them fast. And by the end of the war, you see much more like German shepherds and dogs like that you'd think about as a military dog today. But Major in the book is a border collie, and he was a scout dog. And a lot of the reminiscences of soldiers who served with these dogs say that the best scout dogs were border collies. There was a great breed for that because they're very smart. If you've ever met a border collie, they're very smart. They have a lot of energy, but they follow commands well, and they're very attuned to human emotions. And they made some of the best dogs. So but there's some funny stories. Like one of the things they did in World War II was they had all these Dalmatians, and once they had the Dalmatians, they realized that they really showed up well on the battlefield. They were just too easy to see. And so they got this bright idea that they were going to dye them all. And so they dumped them in big things of dye to make them black. No. And so they couldn't be seen. And that worked okay, but then it rained. And the dye all ran out of the dogs, and they had all these sort of dyed dogs that were slowly fading back. And they were like, okay, that didn't work. But they really were trying anything they could because they thought we need thousands of dogs. And at Fort Robinson alone, there were 6,000 dogs there at any given time, and about 17,000 dogs through the course of the war. So we're talking a lot of animals here. This was not a small program.
Did any other countries catch on to this with the dogs going out? Because it has to, because I'm just even thinking, service dogs and everything. Because I'm thinking about Italy. I know that Major went to Italy, and Italy, I know they use their dogs to sniff out truffles, in the woods and stuff. So it's kind of it's interesting how this whole connection with dogs happens. But did other countries use dogs during World War II, or did we come up and then
no, I would say that other countries were actually ahead of us in World War II, and so we, I'm not an expert in other countries, but I do know that in the early days of the American dog training program, they actually had experts from England come over and show what the English had been doing with dogs and help some of the American trainers learn new techniques. So, but we were on like many things that the Americans did in World War II, we did them on a scale that had not been seen before. We produced more soldiers, more weapons, all this material, and we also trained dogs on a scale. So, I imagine what it must have been like, because when they started the Fort Robinson camp, they were trying to do it quickly, and I've seen some of the requisitions where they're asking, we need 10,000 bowls, we need 6,000 dog collars, we need material for 10,000 dog houses, and we need it all tomorrow. And I can imagine the poor person from the quartermaster court saying, "You need what?" So really? how do I get 10,000 bowls? That's a great question, but that's how they built it. They built it quick.
Wow, that's amazing, and I like it because it's the country coming together, right, for the common good. Now, history Nebraska, because I'm talking about the, at the beginning I introduced you as like the Nebraska State Historical Society, that you're the director and CEO of that. But you guys go right down to its History Nebraska, and you can go on the website, everyone. It's history.nebraska.gov, and you can learn more about Fort Robinson through there. But so how much of history is part of your tourism to Nebraska? I'm fascinated about this because of our other travel writer, Debbie Stone, coming up to Northwest Nebraska. And she's like, girls, man, we all have to go there. There's so much going on, So how much history is part of why people come up to visit?
It's a big part. Of course, we're biased because that's what we do, but we have a network of historic sites all across the state, and so you can trace from the history, Native American history, going back 14,000 years, all the way up to the present. So we have historic sites that cover all of those topics here in Nebraska that we operate. Just if you think about Fort Robinson by itself, it's got huge connections to American history. It was a fort in the Indian Wars, and it was where Crazy Horse was killed. The Lakota Crazy Horse was killed there, and it was if Buffalo soldiers served out there, African American soldiers, and then it was the last Army remount station. So some of the greatest horses ever bred in the United States were bred at Fort Robinson. Kentucky Derby winners were bred at Fort Robinson. So it was a great horse culture. And then during World War II, it had the dog program as well. And then it became a USDA cattle research station, and now it is a National Historic Landmark, and it is an absolutely gorgeous part of the state. A lot of people think about Nebraska as being flat, but that's because you're traveling along the Platte River where pioneers went through, and that's the easiest way to go. But Fort Robinson is beautiful with these sandstone buttes that rise above the prairie, and these grasses and lakes, and it is just a stunningly gorgeous place to visit.
I'm looking at it now on your website, and I don't know. Nancy and I both have a thing about prairies and grasslands because, and I think there's a misconception of it too. Prairies are just laden with bird life, and all kinds of activity goes on wildlife-wise, right? And I always think about, the settlers coming in, the pioneers, settlers. It's interesting how we put those two together, right? Pioneer, settler, because you had to go
one
across
leads to the other.
I know, but it's so the amount of work and the fear. We were talking about fear earlier, coming across the country to Nebraska, and didn't they kind of almost have to dry farm at the beginning? But you have rivers, right? You were saying that too. But I mean, that had to be a hard life to set up Nebraska at the very beginning. Yes,
and one of the main things about Nebraska is it's really the central way on the Oregon Trail for people that were heading west, and so this was the largest human migration in historic memory, with all of these people passing through, and then the ones who remained. One of the things that made that possible was windmills, and so to pump water, to get water out from underground and be able to bring it up, and that made it possible. And so that sort of changes how settlement happens as well. So, a lot of the landmarks that are on the Oregon Trail, one of our other historic sites is Chimney Rock in the western part of the state, which is actually on Nebraska's quarter. It's that significant to the state's history, and that is the most described geological formation on the Oregon Trail. More people, sketch Chimney Rock in their diaries than any other spot on the Oregon Trail, and it was just this huge landmark, and it's still a very visited site. It's a really great way to understand that western migration that happened in the United States.
Wow, that's amazing because you got such rich Native American history, of course, too. And that's the indigenous people of America. And so when you think about all these cultures coming through, and then here's World War II. So when you go to Fort Robinson, you've got a kennel there, right? I believe that people can visit a dog kennel from back in World War II.
If you visit Fort Robinson, you can see the remains, what's left of the dog training center, and we have paths and we have interpretive signage, so you can see how they trained the dogs and where they were, and we have a museum there that interprets not just that part of Fort Robinson's history, but all of it. But you can see artifacts from the dog training program and dog houses and things like that. And if you go to our website, if you can't get to Western Nebraska, if you want to just go to history.nebraska.gov, you can see pictures of the dog training program that we used as the basis for the illustrations in the book Major a Soldier Dog. So you can see all of that rich history all there together, and also pictures of other parts of Fort Robinson's history and Nebraska's history as well.
Cool. Now, are you selling the book Major a Soldier Dog through your gift shops, through the museums, and through your organization?
Absolutely. You can go to history.nebraska.gov/books, and you can get it there, but it's also available on Amazon or Barnes & Noble, and if you are lucky enough to have an independent bookseller, you could see if they're carrying it. If not, you can ask them to get you a copy.
Yeah, go
Cool.
to your independence.
Yeah.
I'm always like fighting for the independence, But really, Nancy and I both appreciate your work in this. And how many books have you written now? I mean, I know you've done a number of them. Have you done a lot of children's books, or?
This is my first children's book. This was the first children's book that I've ever done, and I really just felt that this was a story that lent itself to kids, that it was a story about a little boy giving up his dog, and I felt like that should be something that kids can bond with, and I think they have, and I've heard a lot of stories about, it's really for young readers, but even for little kids, you can find the dog on every page, because there's at least one dog on every page of the book, and for older people, there's a lot of historical facts, and there's an extensive afterword where we really describe the real history behind this. And it was important to me, and I'm probably the only one who really cares, but all the illustrations, we wanted to make sure that they were as accurate as we could possibly make them. So when people are wearing uniforms, we wanted those uniforms to be right. When when things are happening in the book, we wanted that to look like how things actually happened in World War II. And even though it's a book for kids, we wanted it to tell a true story. And that's what it is, a true story.
I think that's really important. You're glossing over it, but it's credibility, and as you grow up, credibility is huge in what you trust and what you don't trust. So I kudos to you for that, because kids aren't stupid. They remember things, and when they can identify, oh, that's what he said over there, and I recognize that, so I trust it. So I think that's great. I love
integrity.
That credibility. Yeah. I love that.
It's important.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's important, like Nancy said too, because it's like we're visual, and look, Instagram is popular because it's visual, so you want the correct visual, not a fake visual. You know what I mean? So
especially in the world of TV, where some of it's credible, some of it's fiction, and it's meant to be. So for a child to know, well, this is the real deal, I think that's important. I like that.
Yeah, as a parent, which I'm not. But as a parent, if I was a parent, I would buy a book that was credible like that versus one that wasn't, because then I know my child is learning something that's true. It's a fun story, but it's a true story. You made it a true. I mean, it's a true story, but a fun story. Sad at points. I'm just going to say, but that's important too, that kids understand that you can't have sacrifice without sacrifice, right? And that's something that children have to learn as well, that you do give up things in life. So kudos. Yeah, absolutely. And I really hope we get to come out to Nebraska soon. We've had so many detours on this road trip that we're doing. We travel full time on our Love Your Parks tour, but our thing is to document as many parks and public lands as possible, and that includes places like Fort Robinson. And when Debbie came on our show, Debbie Stone, travel writer, she came on and started talking about Northwest Nebraska. I've never been to Nebraska. It's one of my 50 states that I haven't been to, and I'm doing it this year of COVID. And we're like, well, who knew, man? This is amazing. And definitely, we look forward to getting up to your state and learning more, because we love prairies, and there's birds in prairies, and there's a lot of history for sure. So thank you. I love it that isn't it weird how things happen? You ended up on a show on National Dog Day too, so that's cool too. So
absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us, everyone. Again, the book is by Trevor Jones, and it's called Major, a Soldier Dog. You can go to 6footpress.com, and that's 6 spelled out, 6 Foot Press. I would say they should be 4 Foot Press, but because I'm into 4 feet dogs. But anyway, 6footpress.com is the website. And again, for Nebraska's history, go to history.nebraska.gov. Thank you so much for joining us, Trevor.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.